Hello and welcome to Radical Engagements, and we continue our discussion of the debates between James Turley, Chris Cutrone'a, Lawrence Parker. I think those are the key members. About 10 years ago, over Lukacs in the pages of the Weekly Worker, between Chris representing the Private Affiliated Society and James Turley, and I think maybe Lawrence Parker representing the Communist Party of Great Britain Provisional Committee, although I'm not sure that Lawrence Parker is a member of the CPGB Provisional Committee. He may just be a scholar of the Communist Party of Great Britain and all of its various splits and aspects. I know that he is a historian that covers those materials. But he writes a fair amount for the Weekly Worker, and I assume it's fair to say he's probably associated. This is part of a series of debates that also get to a series of ambivalences around Lukacs, and even to some degree Althusser. We'll see how this goes. Dealing with the complex celebrity of George Lukacs meant something more sophisticated than treating him as an honorary member of the SWP, argues Lawrence Parker. This is Lukacs Reloaded. James Turley's supplement to Lukacs was interesting and thought-provoking read. The Antimities of George Lukacs, Weekly Worker, January 24th, 2013. Indeed, I think the CBGB owes a debt of gratitude to the comrade in that his contribution can be counted as the only really serious intervention on the subject from one of its members since the star of Lukacs began to wane in its organization. I don't know exactly when Lukacs waned within the CPGB, but it's interesting to know. Up until the early 2000s, the majority opinion in the CPGB was, of course, extremely critical of the legacy of Lukacs, but his earlier works, History and Class Consciousness, HCC, in particular, were given some respect. This has seemingly changed, and I've been frankly appalled at some of the ignorant nonsense about Lukacs, elitist, office scoring, not worth reading, and so on, that has been spewed and spouted in various CPGB forums over the recent years. I exempt Carla Turley from this charge. The leader of this particular pack has been Mike McNair. I have some time for McNair as a thinker and a writer, but on the subject of Lukacs or Althusser, the Frankfurt School, and so on, you can pretty much guarantee a heap of parrot droppings each time you put your money in the slot. The issue with Comrade McNair is that I have not read anything resembling the recent supplement, which actually attempts to dissect the work from Lukacs, emancipating from his keyboard. Asterisk. Yeah, I don't see that either, and his response to this wasn't a whole lot better. Turley was much more substantive. Some of McNair's critiques of particular individuals I find pretty thin, honestly. And it shows in a lot of his disciples in America who pick up McNair's opinion fairly unvarnished and pretty much adopt it as their own, maybe throwing some more Lenin or Stalin in, depending on their particular predilections, to fill out what they want to fill out. Nonetheless, it is a test. Now, I also have issues with Lukacs. I've talked about him many times. Lukacs, in many ways, is my least favorite of the Marxists, but I'm also famously hostile towards big elements of Althusser, and I've become more sympathetic to elements of Lukacs over time. Though I do think the centerpiece on reification in History and Class Consciousness is kind of a mess. And while I like about half of The Destruction of Reason, and it's a massive collection of essays, the other half I find somewhat less convincing, such as strongly implicating Wittgenstein and the rise of fascism because analytic irrationality. The way that Lukacs uses rationality is actually different from the way it is used by standard individuals, even other Hegelians. And so it's hard to know how to deal with it. Whereas Cutrone'a just doesn't concern himself over late Lukacs. He basically says the Stalinist and leaves it at that. And I've been somewhat critical on Chris, thinking that's an argument. It's a labeling, not an argument. Somewhat accurate one, and we might presuppose that Lukacs was trying to save his ass, but we don't know that. And it is actually too much of a claim to say that we do. Anyway, that's about late Lukacs. We're talking about early Lukacs today, but nonetheless. When I have read the materials looking at the work of John Rees on Lukacs, which is then used to debunk Lukacs, I do not have the space to go into more detail, but I would respectfully suggest that using John Rees as a means to master Lukacs is rather like using Jimmy Savile as a means to master the stroke Manderville Hospital. When Rees or Alex Kalinikos, etc., participate as they do on, for example, Lenin, there's a whole battalion of the CPGB writers on hand to illustrate ways in which they are wrong. If the Socialist Workers' Party writes about Lukacs in its own degenerate manner, then this is seemingly taken as absolute truth and the last word on the subject. Why would we take anything the SWP writes at face value, particularly with a subject as complex as Lukacs, and particularly from people like Rees and Alex Kalinikos, both of whom are kind of Trotskyist Artusarians in a way that doesn't make a lot of sense? Anyway, at least they were. Well, we would do this if we were simply convenient to smear Lukacs through guilt by association with the SWP because he is deemed a threat, wrongly, as I will argue, to the project of rehabilitating the practice of the Second International Center. Now, this is a big issue for the CPGB, as they're called neo-Kautskyists for a reason. Not because they're actually Kautskyans, they're probably closer to Lenin than Kautsky, but that they are interested in the Second International Center program as the basis of what a modern communist program would look like. We also see this in Marxist Unity Group and the people around Cosmonaut Magazine who have similar dispositions. Other people have claimed to take heed from McNair. Bashkar Sankara was big on revolutionary strategy, as was Eric Blanc. I don't think they're actually particularly accurate readers of it, but nonetheless. Turley adds another note of complication, in that his motivation is partly based on salvaging what he can from the Althusserian tradition. Emancipated visions of history and class consciousness have long been philosophically gruel of this camp. I know I have eaten it enough times. However, I do not see many of Turley's comrades buying into this particular motivation, and if anything, there is even more enmity and incomprehension directed towards Althusser, as he simply cannot be made to fit into the what is the next link in the chain, how can we bend the stick this month, instrumental rationalizations that the more obscure theoretical debates in the CBGB Provisional Committee get smothered with sooner or later. You can tell this is some internal sour grapes. Anyway, I am not writing as a follower of Lukacs or his career. I do not self-define as a Hegelian Marxist. History and class consciousness certainly does border on irrationality and mysticism, with the idea of the proletariat being identical subject-object of history, and it certainly is no surprise to me that Comrade Turley finds a whole host of crap in this book. This is what the subject-object of history stuff is what also bothers me. It bothers me for obvious reasons, because you can have a subject which isn't for itself, but is in itself, and you can't know it till it's already happened, and it seems that you can use that to justify pretty much anything you fucking want. And people do. Some people might accuse Cutrone'a of using Lukacs in that way. I would not. I want to say that before people come at me, because I don't think it's true, but I've heard it said many times. It was a favorite of Esri XB of Swampside fame. Anyway, however, I think History and Class Consciousness is still a brilliant work. I've come around on it, even though I don't love all the reification essay, and I really hate the method essay. But anyway, but it does not simply fit into the Stalinized instrumental way the left approaches such text. I will try and treat all such works as unrealized, something like a painter's sketch, where you are alive to brilliance but perceive its flaws. While I follow Karl Kirsch's idea that philosophy needs to be realized, I agree that we should not sign up for the philosopher kings, and that such a realization will be hesitant, partial, and in constant flux. But while it is worthy exercise to dethrone our monarchs, I would be very wary of another trap. McNair and Turley want to knock Lukacs off the absurdist pedestal of the philosopher of Lenin, but in doing so, they have been trying to make him into a sort of useless philosophical gesture. This shares the errors of the philosopher king rationale. Someone is being disposed of so that other figures in the Marxist historical canon, Althusser, Kautsky, can rise up again. Maybe they will not be kings, but there will certainly be some writers that are more equal than others. Know what I mean? The New Left method. Turley writes, for Lukács, as he survives for us today, has a second life with the emergence of the 1960s-70s New Left. His persistence as a theoretical touchstone to this day is a product of the 1960s as much as the 1920s, not the least because the 1960s generation of Marxists who are most clearly indebted to him. It is completely correct to locate a fault line in this generation's adoption of Lukács, which suffers from its inability to perceive history and class consciousness as one of the many points of departure, or to paraphrase Trotsky, not a closed circle, but a loop, one end moving into the past and another into the future. Yes, that's almost always true with historical things, which is why we end up doing so much reception history on this show. I know it's the least sexy part of this is like, how were people reading this text in 1920 different from the way they were reading it in 1960, different from the way they're reading it now? But it's sometimes really important to know, and it's not as fun and as immediately accessible as like, oh, well, reader response theory, every response is valid, or we can know the truth of what Lenin said through his words. No, you can't, and no, you can't. Anyway, Turley, the problem for the so-called New Left is that, in general, it has been unable to locate history and class consciousness in this movement, which results in fixation on history and class consciousness. Part of the issue behind this is that the New Left was instrumentally concerned with the constructing a set of frail sect orthodoxies, which, in the case of Lukács, led to a suspicion of his ultra-leftism in the period before history and class consciousness, while the works of the mid-1920s were suspect partly because of support for Stalin's faction of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, despite the fact that all of Lukács' post-history and class consciousness over has been an enormously contradictory relationship to official communism. See below. Yeah, the idea that later Lukács is just Stalinized is actually also, I think, a little bit too simple. Way too simple. I do think it has an effect. I don't think Cutrone'a and others who mention it are wrong to bring up some of that motivation. I think we should consider it. But as I've said earlier, we can't know the internal mind of Lukács unless we find a smoking gun. And the Taylism book that was found recently about some of this accusation and his own thoughts of it is not a smoking gun for all of that. So we have to continue to look. It's not like finding the Black Notebooks for Heidegger made certain Heideggerian things that were already pretty obvious if you really wanted to figure out Heideggerese more clear. So the New Left was left with a history and class consciousness free frame, a snapshot, which is forced to endlessly pour over in its stark towers. Unfortunately for Turley, his presentation is implicated in this method, and history and class consciousness is taken for granted as the ultimate point of departure for his understanding of Lukács. While I accept this as is an advance on taking John Rhee as the last word on the subject, the inability to establish any clear dialectic in relation to Lukács themselves leads to a flattening and sorting effect in Turley's account. Turley argues, quote, in particular, the directly political content of history of class consciousness is indebted most heavily to the mass action left of the socialist movement, which hit its moment of greatest plausibility during the post-war, post-October revolutionary wave, which spread across Europe. However, he moves on to partially contradict this statement by discussing quite correctly the fact that Lukács' leftism had begun to unravel by the time of the publication of History and Class Consciousness in 1923. But for Turley, this process of unraveling has no consequences for history and class consciousness itself, at least none that I can see. Unfortunately, as I had previously pointed out in the debate with the comrade, his account of the process is fundamentally garbled. In response to the specific point on history and class consciousness was a continuation of an earlier ultra-leftism, Michael Lowry points out that Lukács had substantially recast at least two of the essays, What is Orthodox Marxism and Class Consciousness, for the 1923 publication, with the watershed movement coming in the middle of 1920, when Lenin's left-wing communism and infantile disorder pamphlet appeared. For example, does the following passage, which was inserted into the 1922 version of What is Orthodox Marxism, do not let us forget either that every attempt to rescue the ultimate goal or essence of the proletariat from every impure contact with capitalist existence leads ultimately to the same remoteness from reality, from practical critical activity to the same relapse into the utopian dualism of subject and object, of theory and practice, to which revisionism has succumbed. Hopefully, or I guess helpfully for comrades Torley and McNair, Lukacs briefly tips his hat to left-wing communism in a footnote to this point, suggesting that he saw it, rightly or wrongly, as a piece of with Lenin's work. Attentive readers will also note that such passages do not lend themselves very easily to the idea of mass action leftism, with its undertone of conspiracy behind the backs of the proletariat. Dislocated. It might be helpful if, at this point, I try to get my own view of what is going on in history of class consciousness. Lars T. Lee has argued that Lenin had a historic scenario of the Revolutionary Party inspiring a general mass movement and a mass conscious party of the popular classes, as opposed to the traditional Trotskyist perversion of this, which involves a tiny minority manipulating the befuddled masses. My take on Lukacs in 1923 is of an activist who was starting to observe Lenin's standpoint, which means that history and class consciousness is essentially a transitional and eternally dislocated. The further flowering of his engagement with the heroic scenario was, in my reading, not history and class consciousness at all, but later, and also problematic, Lenin, 1924, a book that I need to read, and one that I haven't seen translated freshly in a long time. Anyway, back to the text. One can see this heroic perspective clearly flowering into life in an essay such as Class Consciousness, dated 1920, but also pointed out above, recast for publication in 1923. The argument presented here are infused with the idea of the objective possibilities, not the mundane sociological realities put over by Lukacs' critics, inherent in the proletariat and proletarian class consciousness. Only the consciousness of the proletariat can point its way that leads out of the impasse of capitalism. What a contrast with the petty tyrants of today's left with their lamed and incremental view of the working class consciousness. Keep it simple for the workers and so on. Yeah, I get that today, and it shows up in my comment section all the time, and it fucking pisses me off. No, workers are not formally educated, but if they ask what a word means, you can tell them, because most of them have picked up plenty of jargon in their fields of employment. It's not like jargon is unique to academia. It's unique to any specialized anything. Now, a lot of jargon is useless mystification, which is used to keep guild powers. It's absolutely true. But some of it's actually necessary to remove it from the kind of nebulous language of everyday speech. Anyway. Workers understand that pretty fucking well. They're not stupid, even if they're not always even literate. All right. This idea that the majority of the workers have no executive function and can't understand anything seems to be more of a side effect of people who are used to video games and have their own executive function damaged, not anyone who has to work manual labor for a living. Trust me, when I worked with contractors, a lot of them read plenty. Now, they weren't always reading communist theory. In fact, most of them weren't reading that at all, but they were not an illiterate bunch. Reading is cheap. Anyway. Other points, such as where Lukacs discusses examples of reified consciousness in relation to empiricism and abstract utopianism, could stand as good, if rather abstract, injunctions against the practice of today's proponents of the mass strike. Quote, in one case, consciousness becomes either a complete passive observer, moving in obedience to laws in which it can never control, and the other regards itself as a power which is able of its own subjective volition to master essentially meaningless motion of objects. Yes, so the mass strike will never be good enough. And I've also agreed with that. So when Comrade Turley talks of a semi-anarchist mass action leftism that informed history and class consciousness, or its status as an expression of Lukacs' philosophical voluntarism rather than his realistic political activism, we have to reply that this is not just factually incorrect, but it's undialectical nonsense of the first order. Ouch. How dare something be undialectical? As for the so-called followers of Lukacs included in Conrad Turley's grisly litany of modern-day Hegelian visions, the New Harley family, well, he can scarcely be asked to answer for their heresies, any more than Lenin could be held to account for Alex Kalinikos. Ouch. Also, ouch. Or Trotsky, for that matter, could be held to account for Alex Kalinikos. Of course, Lukacs' account of class consciousness is somewhat abstract and flawed, and it's quite correct for Turley to reproduce a quote from Lukacs' 1967 preface to History and Class Consciousness, quote, "What I intended subjectively and what Lenin had arrived at as a result of an authentic Marxist analysis of the practical movement was transformed into my account of a purely intellectual result and thus into something contemplative. In my presentation, it would indeed be a miracle if I have imputed consciousness could turn into revolutionary practice." However, at least Lukacs' preface is trying to come up with a balance sheet of history and class consciousness to determine what it belongs to the past and what links it to the future, even if shifting his rather notorious doublethink becomes somewhat tiresome and counterproductive. Yeah, later Lukacs is all over the place. In other words, he is thinking dialectically. Turley, and what is an entirely appropriate metaphor for his theoretical practice, is concerned merely to nail the coffin shut, to fix Lukacs as an immobile, inert concept among exterior objects. Conrad Turley is utterly precluded from seeing any movement in his subject away from ultraleftism and imperfectly towards Lenin's heroic perspective for the proletariat, partly because, as already noted, there is little or no sense in his piece of what preceded and what followed history and class consciousness. Partly because in the current CGB version of Lukacs, he has many followers in the SWP. He simply must be made up as a straw man on which to hang all the anti-democratic fallacies of the mass strike theory. Asterisk. I mean, the SWP was also fooled all Tusarians, including Kalinikos, so I find this pretty funny. Anyway. In reality, as many of us saw many years ago, the SWP's adoption of Lukacs, partial and fallacious as it was a howling contradiction in relation to its practice in the real world. There is no simple and neat homology between its philosophical adoption of Lukacs and its other nefarious practices. In that light, the CPGB's current orthodoxy stands revealed as rather naked and unimpressive instrumentalism. Ouch. Always remember that some people's choices are about who they're fighting with, not what they actually should believe, given the consequences of their other beliefs or their material incentives. Because there are other material incentives that we often should consider. Anyway, these problems reach an absolute farcical pitch when Turley turns his attention to what, to my mind, is the sharpest, although again, thoroughly transitional essay in history and class consciousness, towards a methodology of the problem of organization. Turley, clearly underwhelmed, writes of this: the bulk of this essay is based around rather obtuse philosophizations of that Leninist party from which emerges from the early Comintern. In this respect, some arguments are perceptive and illuminating on the relationship between discipline and bourgeois individual freedom in particular. Others simply recapitulate classic mass action arguments against the Second International Center, albeit obscured by Hegelian jargon. At the very best, such a statement can be read as ambiguous and grudging. At worst, it is downright misleading. The first point is a historical one. The essay is dated September 1922, long after the watershed moment of left-wing communism, and it shows, it is crystal clear that we are not dealing with a pure ultra-left anymore. For example, Lukacs dismisses both right and left critics of the United Front tactic in the following terms. The debates about the United Front demonstrated that almost all opponents of such a tactical maneuver suffered from a lack of dialectical grasp of the apprehension of the true function of the party in the developing consciousness of the proletariat, to say nothing of those misunderstandings that led the United Front being taught as to leading to an immediate reunification of the proletariat with a level of organization. Which part of the United Front, though? The United Front from above, the United Front from below, the second international version, or the third international version, etc., etc. All these were still moving points at this time, and the United Front was to give way to the Popular Front. Nonetheless, it's pretty clear that Lukacs was not taking the ultra-left line on that at all. The ultra-left line either abandoned the United Front altogether or argued that it was only allowed from below the same thing that Stalin has said during Third Periodism, although was later abandoned and never practiced in all Marxist-Leninist parties in the 1920s. Anyway, to move on to the substantive point of this, did Lukacs simply recapitulate classist arguments against the Second International Center? No, he did not do this, simply or otherwise. Of substance, he reprised the argument of the Second International Center, of which the Bolsheviks were part, against the sectarian view that abstracted the struggle of the party from the struggle of class in the modern-day Blanquism. To that the end of his argument are not without import today. The problem with this for the unwary was that Lukacs was obviously confused in regards to the political physiognomy of the Second International. He reads the Bolsheviks as always having been on the left, as against Kautsky and the center, which was obviously incorrect. However, this misunderstanding should not obscure the fact of what he was actually saying, and certainly towards a methodology of the problem of organization bears similar transitional markings to the rest of history and class consciousness. Thus, Lukacs argues the Russian Revolution clearly exposes the limitations of the Western European organizations, their impotence in the face of the spontaneous movements of the masses, which clearly expose on the issue of mass actions and the mass set strike. And by the end of this essay, we understand that the contemporary implications of this theory of the mass action and mass strike, the political sects bobbing along and manipulating the unconscious masses into power, has been thoroughly emptied out. Although the trace of its form remains, it is a trap for the unwary. Shifting. I think the following three quotes can simplify his shifting perspective, his clear anti-sectism, and the fact that Lukacs was determined not to yank the party and a conscious proletariat into undialectical poles, despite the necessity of defending dialectically the organization and independence of the Communist Party. I would like to know how dialectically is used in each of those ways in more clarity. Anyway, quote, this is a long quote from Lukacs. The formal ethical view of sex breaks down precisely because it cannot understand that the party of the masses are unified, that there is a vital interaction between the party organization and the unorganized masses. However hostile a sect may be towards the bourgeois society, however deeply it may be convinced, subjectively, of the size of the gulf that separates it from the bourgeoisie, it yet reveals at this very point that is the history coincides with that of the bourgeoisie, and that, in consequence, the structure of its own consciousness is closely related to that of the bourgeoisie. If the sect acts as a representative of the unconscious masses instead of them and on their behalf, it causes historically necessary and hence dialectical separation of the party organization from the masses to freeze into permanence. The struggle of the Communist Party is focused upon class consciousness of the proletariat. Its organizational separation from the class does not mean, in this case, that it wishes to battle for its interest on behalf and in its place. This is what Blanquist did, but to take but one instance. The issue towards methodology of the problem of organization is assuredly not that it recapitulates classic mass action arguments against the Second International Center. The problem arises from the diametric opposite, that a partial reiteration of the Second International Center's argument against sectism and implying that the various communist parties, Russian and international, were now carriers of those values in the context of 1922, means that the essay, as the board correctly stated, reverted in that context to the status of an empty state ideology, one which was further developed a couple of years later in Lenin, A Study in Unity of Thought. In the Soviet Union, the dialectical union of party and class was being increasingly restricted to the formulations of propagandists, and thus Lukacs, against his will, succumbs to its ideology. On the topic of reification and Lukacs' conception of totality, I feel that Comrade Turley has been sadly left adrift by his Althusserian inheritance, and this works back into his reading of Reification and Class Consciousness of the Proletariat, History Essay and History and Class Consciousness. I do, however, take on board Turley's recognition that Althusser's take on totality has its problems. Indeed, one of the weird paradoxes of this debate is, I suspect, from various conversations, we have come to broadly similar conclusions on Althusserian Marxism. Yeah, me too. I am not hateful, but skeptical. Turley writes, why on earth should the commodity have such an extraordinary power to colonize everything? In order to ensure its continuing existence as a mode of production, capitalism needs to return people to work every day to reproduce themselves, as well as a parasitic class of exploiters on top of them. This does not need to colonize everyone's soul. In fact, it has been much happier in a good many situations to leave that job to the priest and the secular inheritors, such as the mass media, who, after all, know one or two things about colonizing souls. In Lukács, this all-conquering power of the commodity is simply assumed. It is a perfectly rational assumption on the basis of Hegelian idealism, where the totality is embodied homogeneously across its particular elements. Althusser and his school called this an expressive totality, and it can be crudely likened to a stick of a Breton rock. Whenever you break it, the same message is written on the cross-section. Nonetheless, the protagonist he offers is pertinent. The various instances of society, the different spheres in which that complicated animal we call human has its existence, lose their own specificity. They become reducible, one and all, via various degrees of mediation, to a single principle. But this principle, and its cruel twist of the dialectic, is condemned to lose its explanatory power. If the commodity fetishism reification accounts for the stupidities of both Mitt Romney and Joseph Ratzinger, then it cannot provide a satisfactory account of either. Yeah, this is my problem with Lukács, is that it doesn't actually explain very much in the totality conception. We have, I don't disagree that the totality is a thing, that there are modes that are emergent to it, but trying to explain everything with it effectively explains nothing at all. And this is a problem, obviously. But this is a problem for more than just Lukácsian thinkers in Marxism. Is this all-conquering power of the commodity assumed in the matter of reducibility to a single principle? To argue this line means ripping apart history and class consciousness and viewing its contents, parts, in frozen isolation, a practice which Lukács rather elegantly destroys on a number of occasions. In What is Orthodox Marxism, Lukács writes, we repeat, the category of totality does not reduce its elements to an undifferentiated uniformity to identity. The apparent independence and autonomy which they possess in the capitalist system of production is an illusion only insofar as they are involved in a dynamic dialectical relationship with one another and can be thought of as a dynamic dialectical aspects of an equally dynamic and dialectical whole. That's a bunch of words. And I've never really found that very convincing. Anyway, a few points become clearer from this. First, the Althusserian critique of Lukács' expressive totality, which can be crudely likened to a stick of Brighton rock. Whenever you break it, the same message is written on the cross-section, is not worth the paper it is written on. He is obviously aware of the danger of merely identifying different societal phases in the simplistic and non-dialectical manner. Also, the emphasis on dynamic interrelationships means that it would be very surprising if Lukács not merely assumed the power of reification, which Turley ascribes. He is not setting up a fixed category of reification that we can pour over in isolation and bloodlessly define. This Althusserian muddle can partly be explained by the confusion over the object of Lukács' critique and the nature of that critique itself, which, in an exquisite irony, Turley crudely soldiers together so that whatever you break it, the same message is written on the cross-section. It is perfectly true that the process of reification seen by Lukács is expansive. The divorce of the phenomenon of reification from their economic basis and from the vantage point from which alone they can be understood is facilitated by the fact that the capitalist process of transformation must embrace every manifestation of the life of society if the preconditions for the complete self-realization of capitalist production are to be fulfilled. But this power is not assumed. Lukács foresees a time when natural forces of the market come to an end, and the unthinking mundane reality that life seems to be held together by natural laws, yet it can experience a certain dislocation because the bonds uniting its various elements and partial systems are by chance fair, even at their most normal. Lukács was, of course, mercilessly critical of the abstraction, quantification, and alienation inherent in capitalist society, but whatever the crudities of history and class consciousness, his critique was not the mere methodology equivalent of what he was being critical of. Turley, and what I presume is another Althusserian lurch, this time backs towards ascribing relative autonomy to various social spheres, queries which the commodity has the power to colonize everything. Isn't it, after all, churches and mass media do a rather better job of this? And can the commodity fetishism reification account for the stupidities of both Mitt Romney and Joseph Ratzinger? I'm still kind of with Turley on that one, but we'll continue. In the flat, fixed, and undifferentiated spectacles of which Turley views Lukács and the history of commodity fetishism reification clearly cannot account for much of anything. The dialectical reality, I think Lawrence is Parker is over-relying on the word dialectical to do a lot of work. You need to define what he means by it. It has multiple meanings, even in Marxism. Anyway, of history and class consciousness is somewhat different. Lukacs identifies a clear trend towards quantification in the capitalist world that blurs distinction. Quote, the distinction between the worker faced with a particular machine, the entrepreneur faced with a given type of mechanical development, the technological faced with the state of science and the profitability of its application to technology is purely quantitative. It does not directly entail any qualitative difference in the structure of consciousness. But this shift also entails the division of labor. This enables the artificially isolated partial functions to be performed in the most rational manner by specialists who are specially adapted mentally and physically for the purpose. This has the effect of making the partial functions autonomous, so they tend to develop through their own special laws independently of the partial functions of society. So Lukacs is acutely alive to the issue of differentiation and specialization. Yes, he is. Which precisely flows from the expansive totality bewitched by the commodity, and thus his theory emphatically does provide a framework to account for the stupidities of both Mitt Romney and Joseph Ratzinger. Not completely, though. Dr. Parker, I think you need to develop this a little more. I think it's there, but it's not fully fleshed out in a way that is useful. And as everyone I've ever talked to is specialized in Lukacs, this is something you recognize only after it has happened. And that is always a perfect circle. A Hegelian perfect circle. Ugh. Stalinism. Finally, it is probably necessary to say something to the rather depressing topic of Lukacs and Stalinism. Turley does not deal with this in his critique, and I largely agree with his comments against the capitulation dogma of Chris Cutrone'a. Yeah, this is the only thing we're going to get about Chris, but it's going to come up. Chris is going to respond to this. A few weeks back, sympathizers of the CPGP were sent an email, Notes for Action, January 24th, introducing Comrade Turley's critique with the join the dotted lines that Lukacs was the favorite Stalinist of a number of living members of the SWP. This is horseshit on a number of levels. First, as you would hope the writer of this charming epithet would realize, the SWP does not praise Lukacs on any level after his capitulation to Stalin in the mid-1920s. Second, if Lukacs did become a Stalinist, then it was of a very particular stamp. Yeah, it was. And I want more going on there. On one level, there is no way to prettify Lukacs in the mid-1920s by choosing Stalin's faction and the illiterate politics of socialism in one country. That's really Bukharin, and although Bukharin and Stalin meant different things by it, which a man as erudite and cultured as Lukacs must surely have known was complete nonsense, he effectively maimed his politics. Right up until his death in 1971, he still stuck to the mealy-mouthed logic chomping on the subject, such as the Moscow trials. He maintained that he personally found the trials to be monstrous, but was tactically neutral on the broader political issues involved. Vomit. That anybody who self-identifies themselves as Lukacian or as a follower of Lukacs across his entire career risks making their politics almost entirely useless for the 20th century. That much is clear. Yeah, the instrumentalization, which I know something people will be mad about, Lukacs and destruction of reason essays and a lot of later Lukacs is a problem. And there is a lot of logic shopping there. And there's a lot of, well, I am appalled by X, but this is one of the things that turned Lakatosh against Lukacs so deeply. And they knew each other. All right. However, to make the correct judgment, there are a host of countervailing factors to take into account. Lukacs had already his own line and appeared to view his career as an underground guerrilla war against Stalinist bureaucracy. Most of his works from the 1930s onwards, counts in an Aesopian language, can be read as indictments of this or that official communist inscription. Yeah. Even later works are like, even Destruction of Reason is not totally in line with Stalinist orthodoxy or the Soviet orthodoxy. They're not. They do throw them a lot of bones, but it's not clear to me anyway, and going through that book, that's all that's going on there. And some of the weirder elements of the book are actually not in line with Soviet Marxism. So make of that what you will. Like, Stalin is not railing about the dangers of Wittgenstein. Most of his works from the 1930s onwards was this communist inscription, an obvious example being his rearguard defense of critical reason against the irrationality of Soviet ideological conjecture. Towards the end of his life, Lukacs has become much more of an outspoken critic of actually existing socialism, but the tactical choices he had made earlier in his career still maimed his outlook. As he put it bluntly himself, I've always thought that the worst form of socialism was better to live in than the best form of capitalism. Unfortunately, this absurd outlook meant that choosing the worst kind of bureaucratic police dictatorship, and Terry Eagleton's brilliant critique, Lukacs's gibbed at Stalinist dreary Philistinism, and privately winced at the pathetic socialist realism. A lonely, aloof Hegelian, he became the idea that entered upon the real, alienated existence, the heart of a heartless world, the soul of soulless conditions, and indeed, at base, the opium of the people. But here is another thought, one that I have heard plenty of comrades mouthing off about their own anti-Stalinist credentials and using Lukacs as the kind of whipping boy to prove their impeccable revolutionary moral fiber. That's something we see today, by the way. There's a lot less of people trying to prove they're not Stalinists anymore, and more people making Stalin a ventriloquist dummy for whatever the fuck they want to be a ventriloquist dummy for. It's hard to even critique something as Stalinist now because there's so much shit that claims it that has nothing to do with it. There's people taking ultra-left positions. There's people taking Duginist positions. There's people taking Yakiist positions. There's people taking social democratic positions or Bukharinist positions, all under the name of Stalin. And while I'm not here to defend the good name of Stalin, I'm not ultimately a Stalin defensist. This is ridiculous, ultimately. But that used to be the case that people would bend over backwards to prove their anti-Stalinist credentials, something I'm also not particularly interested in doing. Neither Stalinophobic nor Stalinophilic shall I be. However, this stance ignores the fact that Lukacs was an active opponent of the Soviet-inspired police dictatorship in Hungary, particularly after his participation in the Nagy government of 1956, which a lot of people gave him a lot of shit for. See article I did by Lester McIntyre that talks about Lukacs fucking up on that. Of course, it would not have been Lukacs if there had not been some strong dose of naivete in regards to the potentiality of the bureaucracy to ethically reform itself. This, for example, Lukacs described to the bizarre illusion that the Warsaw Pact would protect Hungary from Western and Soviet interventions. That's hilarious. Lukacs was eventually captured by the Russians and held prisoner in Romania, a process under which he refused to submit to a demand to denounce his comrades and came out with a great deal of honor. That's not talked about enough. Should give Lukacs more credit for that. On this occasion, there was to be no lying self-criticism. My interrogators said to me that they knew that I was no follower of Amri Nagy, and so there was no reason that I should not testify against him. I told them that as soon as the two of us, Amri Nagy, I have no idea how to say that, I can't pronounce Hungarian, and myself were free to walk around Budapest, I would be happy to make public my opinion of all of Nagy's activities. For those tempted to smear Lukacs as just another run-of-the-mill Stalinist or at best a mere capitulator, think hard, comrades, and think long. All right. This is Chris Cutrone's response to like one line. I actually think Parker, even though I'm not totally convinced by everything he says, makes a damn good argument for the importance of history and class consciousness, and even maybe taking later Lukacs seriously, as I've talked with Daniel Tutt and some other people about. I don't think just saying he was a Stalinist deals with all of this. But let's see what Comrade Cutrone has to say about this. Lawrence Parker makes passing reference to my take on Lukacs and accuses me of dogmatic anti-Stalinism. Lenin Reloaded, March 7th, 2013. I know that Lukacs remained a dissident of sorts. The problem is that later Lukacs opposed Stalinism from the right rather than from the left. Okay, sure. In what way? As Adorno put in as pitifully about the book Destruction of Reason, this expressed merely the destruction of the author's own. I'm going to have to look up that. I agree with Parker that Lenin's critique of left-wing communism was an essential point of departure for Lukacs' book, History and Class Consciousness. There, Lenin addresses the problem of workers' own bourgeois consciousness and a political practice, but as something to be worked through. About Parker's critique of the earlier Lukacs, however, it only appears that Lukacs was mystifying because the high level of abstraction at which history and class consciousness is pitched. No, some of that is actual mystification, Chris, like some of what you say. There's a lot of not specifying and only specifying when pinned down. Naughty, naughty. I also think Hegelianism has a tendency to use baffling language somewhat on purpose. And in Hegel, it makes more sense because there is an actual theological vision going on there. I know people will argue with me that it's not important. I think they're wrong. I think they're very wrong. Nonetheless, it's a defensible position, even if I think it's very wrong. But to say that there's no mystification in there, since you have all kinds of circular totalities, is another thing entirely. Something about circular totalities, even in a Hegelian perspective, is they're kind of not understandable. That is definitionally a mystification. Anyway, as Lukacs put it in the beginning of his essay, Reification and the Consciousness of the Proletariat, the centerpiece of history and class consciousness, at the stage in the history of mankind, there is no problem that does not ultimately back to the question that there is no solution that could not ultimately found in the solution of the riddle of commodity structure. Of course, the problem can only be discussed with a degree of generality if it achieves the depth and breadth found in Marx's own analysis. Now, I would love for them to talk more about the commodity structure in this. This meant that Lukacs took Marx for granted and did not seek to revise them. The same can be said of Lenin and Luxemburg in Lukacs' view. He presupposes them precisely in a way that we cannot today. As a result, Lukacs' history and class consciousness can be seen as nebulous, where it actually aims to be very concrete. I think that's fair. I think Chris is right about that. But I think Parker does have a point that history and class consciousness is a moving document from a moving man, and it was picked up in moving time periods, and it also moves. Our relationship to it can't be the relationship of the 1920s, and it's not just a diminishment, it's literally impossible. All right. Now, we can know that relationship better, we can document it, we can do a reception history, but we can never embody that. And that's a crucial distinction. When dealing with all of this stuff, you can't embody any of Lenin either. You're not in that context. You can understand it, you can revise it, you can learn from it, you can use it and reappropriate it to your context if you're given the opportunity to. But you can't understand it in the same way that it initially existed, because you are not that person in that material world. That does not mean that you can't approach it and build models of what those people thought, but full knowledge versus modeled partial knowledge. Modeled partial knowledge is usually all we're giving when we're dealing with such abstract things. Is not possible in the same way. Time moves, you move with it. Anyway. But in Marx's phrase in the Grudesson, Hegel's method, it is a concretion of abstractions. This is the method, Marx's method in Das Kapital that Lukacs championed in HAC. I would love to go more about what the method specifically is that Lukacs is championing in HAC, other than, Platypus not dealing much with, except in their German section, with Das Kapital and its actual economic implications, because they think the work of Friedrich Pollock actually supersedes it, or at least develops from its initial assertions of the new context. At least that's what I gather from Chris's own speech on the matter. I'm sure he'll inform me of more. Anyway, someone needs to put all this together. But I do think overall there is a concretion of abstraction. So in a very abstract theoretical way, there is some way in which that method relates. But there's also in which I do think Chris is downplaying how much Lukacs is hollowing that method out, because that method has specific relations, not just an imminent critique. That's never going to be good enough. There's an emergence from the imminent critique. And I do wish certain people took that more seriously. Comrade, I know you watch these. I enjoy it. This is not me calling you out either. I really do want to know, what you think is the crucial core that is carried between both, other than concrete and abstraction. Abstraction and concretion, or the concretion of abstractions. Yes, that is a movement in the dialectic of Marx, absolutely. But what does it mean in this specific instance is a different thing. What does it mean for you? What does it mean for Lukacs? And what does it mean for Marx? And if you say they're the same thing, I don't really believe you. I don't believe you because I've just articulated why I don't think that's possible. Now, if you say they're of a grand thread and they develop over time, that is possible. In fact, it's most likely true. Anyway, back to the text. Challenges of Comrade Cutrone'a aside. What justifies such a Hegelian or perhaps simply philosophical approach, Lukacs, following Marx, Engels, Lenin, Luxemburg, among others, is concerned with the various transformation of social relations, and this means working through the categories of such social relations, critical self-reflection, and thought, not only are primarily as a matter of thinking. Lukacs joined the Communist Party and was a commensor in the 1919 Hungarian Revolution. Lukacs was a responsible comrade in the way that no one today can possibly be. That's true. You are not living in a revolutionary society to fail, even as Lukacs did, so you cannot be responsible in that way. And that's true for Chris and me, and Chris would happily admit that. Lukacs wrote History and Class Communists as a member of Communist International, not as an academic. Although he was an academic, even in his functioning as a responsible comrade, which is something that you have to see. You can't fully divorce yourself from your prior position. And the commodity form and its reification after the Industrial Revolution is a problem of social relations, not directly of those supposed by empirical reality. Okay, this is a mystification. Is a problem of social relations, not directly those of supposed empirical reality. I mean, okay, what is of supposed empirical reality? It is rather a matter of how such social reality is mediated in both practice and in theory. All right, how is it mediated? Be more specific. I'm constantly asking Chris to be more specific. This is something that has got years of our interactions going. I mean, like when I was in Platypus Affiliate Society, when I was a blogger and we argued on my blog, I was always asking more specificity. I was wrong about a lot of things. And Chris's challenges is part of why I learned them. It's why I can't just announce them simply because A, I don't think a lot of the announcements are totally true, and B, both learning from and against Chris Cutrone'a is part of what makes me who I am. There's no denying of that, just like my tenure with Doug Lane or my experience as a worker in Georgia or my experiences abroad for 8 years or my relationships or my understanding of capital, my moving from being an insurance worker to a teacher. All these affect me. There's no way they don't. Anyone who totally cuts it out or doesn't admit that or has an anxiety of influence, to use Harold Bloom's phrase, where they won't totally be honest about that, is failing themselves, not just their former teachers and nemesis and or friends. And your nemesis and friends are often the same people. All right. Anyway, but I would like to know more about what Chris thinks is actually going on here. Yes, this is mediated. The social theory is mediated, but in which way is it relevant here? Pedagogically, it needs to be clarified. It is one thing to throw it out as a thought provoker to kind of get people to think. It's another thing to just not clarify it ever. And one's action as a pedagogue and one's actions as a theorist, you need to be somewhat separated in this regard. That's just me, but I've been a teacher for a long time. Anyway, in Lukacs' terms, it is precisely the most apparently immediate in practice that has been grasped in its essential mediations. The problem is how capitalist obscures its mediations. Yes. Okay, fair. So we got some this, but we're not seeing what the mediations are. The problem is how capitalism obscures its mediations. Yes, it does. What are mediations? But this also includes the struggle against capitalism can obscure its own mediations. Yes, it does. But again, which mediations? We need to get more specific. Of course, all these in abstract are true, but these are vagaries. Be specific. Vagary is a form of mystification, which is why I brought it up earlier. Operating at the abstract at the level is fine as long as one eventually fully concretizes it and talks about it in specific utilization, which Marx does. I mean, not just in capital, but like you have all the developments of capital. You have it in Rendesa. You have it in theories of surplus value. Like he goes into pretty damn specific things. Anyway, Back to the text. But this also includes a struggle against capitalism, how it skews mediations, which are part and parcel of the history of capitalism, not outside of and independent of it. That's true. Anti-capitalist reaction is part of capitalism. It emerges from capitalism organically from its first instantiation, even before you have the Industrial Revolution, which Chris puts more importance on than I do. I think the beginning of banking and using wages and variable capital is actually the more important element, which leads to the Industrial Revolution as a concept of reinvestment. But you already saw it in the agrarian proletariat. But I'm sure Chris will tell me that there's no capital before that because somehow land isn't capital because it's not productive. Land of capital is that it's controlled as capital and can be traded as capital. That's what deeds are fucking sold for. But nonetheless, let's go back. This is a sub-argument between Chris and I. One that has never really come out before. All right. This is a problem of modern society, of bourgeois social relations. Yes, duh. But again, let's get more specific. The thing is, in general, I often think Chris is right here. And I just want to know if I am agreeing to something specific, or if these are just general vagaries, which are true. They're not false vagaries, but not particularly clarifying. Or is there something specific I'm agreeing to, but it's not stated here? That needs to be clarified. Clarification is important. I mean, that's like a basic statement, right? The problem of modern society bourgeois social relations. These are social relations of labor in the modern urban life specifically, as opposed to traditionalist customs of pastoral agriculture and its caste values. Yes. Which were not so mediated. No, they were direct. Mostly. Sometimes. Although their indirectness is part of what led to capital. Anyway, we're just going to get on a debate over the long transition from medieval society to capitalist society. And I put those in quotations not because I don't believe that there's a separation between medieval and capitalist, because it's unclear the moment in which that separation fully emerges. And it doesn't seem to be the revolutions. The Anshan regime is not really truly purged until World War I, which is really kind of late, considering you start seeing capitalist social relations emerge as early as the 15th century, but not enough to dominate the social totality, so we can't call these capitalist societies. And I think Chris might call this pre-capitalist bourgeois society. I don't think such a thing really exists, but we can go back and forth. Anyway. Part of the thing I think that does is create a liberalism that is pre-capitalist and more pure and uncorrupted by the accumulation of capital, which can be manifested through the workers and it's a subject of history. I think this is a summation of what I think Chris's position seems to be. We've argued about that before, and I'm going to trust whatever he says as his own position, because I think doubting someone who you have no instance of considering a liar is also bullshit practice. I don't think Chris is lying about what he believes. I don't think he's always clear about it. Those are different things. Like, for example, he does not support Trump. He doesn't support Trumpism. He said this multiple times. He's really ecstatic about certain things that support Trump. Whereas I just don't care. Like, not that I don't care about many of the values. And in fact, some of what I find about the lawfare of both the GOP and the Democrats has been just embarrassing and damaging any sense of social order, and even in a capitalist society. It's degenerative. But it's bipartisan. It just happens that the Democrats do control more of the administrative state in some ways, although certain parts of it are not as sympathetic to the Democrats as others. And this moves around. And I do think you kind of have to look at this as an emerging totality and not just talk about like an amorphous blob deep state, but that's just me. Maybe I'd be told I'm being too empirical. And I would like to respond that, empiricism is not the same as demanding some kind of relationship to reality other than an ideal one. If your only relationship to reality is an ideal, seems like it is idealist. Just a thing to consider. I'm not saying that's what Platypus or Cutrone'a believes either. I just think it needs to be stated as a clarification. All right, back to this. What workers do or don't affects essentially the course of development of capitalism as tacit history under which modern society progresses or regresses. You got to give Chris, he likes to hold those teleology together. The workers' movement for socialism was grasped by Marx as part of the dialectic of history. Yes, that was essentially a Marxist point that Lukacs sought to emphasize in History and Class Consciousness, and it is pointless today because there's no such historical movement. I mean, I guess the historical movement we should attach ourselves to is the Republican big R one. I don't know. Chris would say we shouldn't support that, but it's something we have to go through, in which case we're going to go through whatever happens. We have to go through whatever happens. That's what it means for it to happen. You go through what happens. End of discussion. So in which case I'd be like, that's not a very deep point. Are you Montebaileying me? Or not? Like, is this not very deep point, or is it a very deep point? Like, I'm not sure. We need to clarify again. Movement around here. Anyway, reification remained a problem for Marxism to work through. Yes, including and perhaps especially the reification of the workers' movement against capitalism, which threatens subjectively to naturalize this argument as object. Yes. Though Gilles Devey says this too, in a way that I've always wondered what Chris Cutrone'a makes of. We'll come back to that because I actually tied when I was leaving Platypus, but not had less Platypus. I actually wrote an article which talked about this point that Chris is making, and I might have even cited this fucking letter. I don't remember. It was at a conference in Korea with Gilles Devey's when Insurrections Die, as published in Notes Volume 1, but as I had read in translation on Libcom before it was even published by Notes. And used as a key point about my suspicion of workerism. As a person from a working class background, as I do believe Chris Cutrone'a himself is from, I don't trust workerism entirely. I do not think workers as they already exist, can be said to not be affected by capitalist values in a way that fully makes them to overcome it in a way that is coherent and meaningful. And this I agree with Chris on, but I'm not sure the extent of it. Is this just political project, or what is the relationship here? I'm not sure of that in Lukacs either, which is part of my ambivalence. Which is the nationalist argument did become what Marx called an ideology. This was already true in the 1840s when Marxism began, and clearly happened to Marxism itself in the 20th century. Lukacs gave up his critique of such reification, which didn't mean going along with Stalinism in its entirety, but enough to disqualify Lukacs politically, at least as far as the left is concerned. I mean, I would like to know why. So much can be clarified, but just asking Chris why more. He's good at explaining it sometimes, although sometimes it's repetitious. We'll see. I have liked some of his responses. I found some of them clarifying. I've found others just not particularly relevant to the issue at hand. But Chris thinks they are, so I try to adopt a model of mine that makes that charitable, which you should do in critiquing anyone, because critiquing a straw man is somewhat useless unless you just want to be a dick. And sometimes I do just want to be a dick. I'm not going to say I'm above that at all times, at all. Anyway. Lukacs' later work accommodated and promoted the lower horizons of possibility involved in Stalinism, which necessarily meant renouncing and not merely critiquing his earlier work. Chris Cutrone'a, Platypus Affiliated Society. I think that last point is actually still pretty good. Not quite sure what this has to do with the majority of the points made in the Lawrence Parker essay, except about the Stalinization. I do wish that Chris would clarify more and all these things, but this is a letter and it's a response letter, so it's not fair to ask it to be a total fucking dissertation. But sometimes I'd like to read a total fucking dissertation on this stuff as opposed to pithy little essays that are provoking us to think. I tend to distrust things that can make people feel like they agree with something when it's not clear what they're agreeing on. Just call it that. I don't think it's lying necessarily. I don't think it's always dishonest. It's just not. A lot of projection can be involved in that. We all know how that works. So, well, maybe we don't all know how that works, but we should. Anyway, I think the second half clarifies some stuff with Turley. I think I think there's some good points made by Chris in his response, although I'm still not clear exactly all the ways in which For the Left is at stake for Chris. But he'll probably respond. Anyway, I'm gonna cover the Mike McNair piece. I think I covered it before. In fact, I know I did. In fact, the first piece of the cycle that I covered and realized I had to go back and cover all the other ones. So I'm going to cover it again, and I'm going to release the first draft to my patrons. And you guys will get a second draft where I've actually read everything in the debate, so I can comment more meaningfully on what Mike McNair says. I tend to like McNair in certain things, but there are many things in which I think McNair is a little bit too cut and dry, as implied by Lawrence Parker's response. This is a good internal debate culture. We like that here on Varm Blog. Then we're going to be taking a break from this, and I have some other things I promised to cover that I'm going to cover. I might go back to doing the 50s plus uses of the critique of the Goethe program. There's this weird gap where I don't find a lot of critique of the Goethe program or State and Revolution referenced explicitly in Marxist texts. I don't know what to do about that. It's just something to note. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this. I have some announcements coming up in the future about the channel and some changes, and basically I'm going to be posting less. Be looking for that too if you're a regular. And we'll come back to this series. I have some other things I want to cover though for a while, and we're going to get to that. I'm going to try to keep these responses complete like this and break these up less, except when it's a very long text when I have a lot of context that's necessary. There's some stuff that I want to cover that are going to be that. But in general, since I don't want to post every single day and people get lost in 16 episodes on a singular text and all this context, maybe we should keep the things that I can cover in 1 or 2 episodes. Anyway, on all that said, like and subscribe, hit the bell. We have 3 levels of tier support if you want it. Support any of these other groups. Go read The Weekly Worker. Go read Platypus Affiliated Society. You don't have to agree with any of it. I don't agree with a lot of it on both sides. Nonetheless, I think it's important to know. Go read Cosmonaut Magazine. Go read any of these things in the debate, Sublation Magazine, etc., etc., etc. All right. Take care. Keep your peace. And don't try to make predictions because they bite you in the ass. This is just something that I've learned recently. Again, over and over and over again. Unless you make predictions wrongly, really confidently, in which case people will not call you on it. They will call you on what you got right and ignore all the shit you said that was totally bullshit. But yeah, I'm not that kind of guy. Take care.